who want to. And let's start with our prayer on page 152. You are my refuge and defense. Guide me and lead me as you have promised. Keep me safe from the trap that has been set for me. Shelter me from danger. I place myself in your care. You will save me, Lord. You are a faithful God. Amen. Okay, well, let me offer, as always, that we begin with where either the video or the readings or even the last couple of weeks, what Luke has been doing. Is anybody prepared to go first?
Well, I'll go first.
Thank you, Herb.
I went to a wedding here in the last couple of weeks, and during the wedding, we prayed the Lord's Prayer, the whole congregation. And I found it interesting because as we got to the end, the doxology part of the Lord's Prayer that we pray, kingdom power and glory forever and ever, amen. Half the congregation didn't pray. And so I thought about that. And so I was reminded that here we are reading Matthew and Luke, and the Lord's Prayer is in there. And it's different in the Matthew version than it is in the Luke version. The Luke version ends with, lead us not into temptation, which is kind of just drops, it stops right there. And right. Matthew adds, and deliver us from evil. But then we've added in our church the doxology part. And I'm reminding from our study of the early Christian writings we did at EFM, that the Didache, which is the original Book of Common Prayer written in the first century, the Lord's Prayer is in there with that doxology. And so that existed from the very early Christian church. I think the Didache was written around 90 CE, I think. And so it's appropriate that we have that doxology because it kind of helps. There's nothing wrong with saying adding that doxology because they add doxologies to many prayers. But it's interesting that that's not in Luke or Matthew, that we've added that later. So, but it's been around for 20 centuries now. So, but that was just as I read this, something that made me think and reminded me about what we had, something I had learned before that I had kind of forgotten about. So that's maybe not exactly an answer to your question, but that was something that I thought was interesting, and this really reminded me of that.
Thanks, Herb. Can I push you with one other question about that?
Yes.
Did you notice in the Lord's Prayer that we get in Luke that it's not forgive us our trespasses, it's forgive us our debts? Yes.
Yes, I had seen that too, and we say that both ways, I guess, as I remember, different times. Isn't that correct?
Well, I don't think we actually ever say debts. Ellen can tell me. I didn't think we do that in the church, even though that seems to be what Luke has in mind. And I'm wondering if you differentiate at all between debts and trespasses, or how you make that differentiation. I know I put you on the spot.
Yes.
But this can be for the group as well, and maybe you don't care about this question, and that's okay.
I do. It's an interesting question. I kind of see them as similar. I thought just different interpretations. But maybe it's actually I haven't read the Greek, I guess. So would Greek be using different words, I guess?
Well, I got to think about whether Matthew uses a different word than Luke does, but there's no doubt that Luke uses the word debt, as in a financial debt.
Oh, in terms of financial? Okay.
It's about money in Luke, yeah, and that bears out in Luke. Luke. Jesus has more to say about money in Luke than any of the other Gospels.
Okay, well, that's an interesting learning for me, and I didn't know that.
Well, and by the way, just because it's written one way doesn't mean that we don't have the opportunities to use reason and tradition to kind of to dicker with it, to be honest, because we understand that there are both financial debts and moral debts and relational debts, right? Trespass is an interesting term. Usually we relegate that to property, just if we're honest. That's how the word functions in English today, right? Let's not touch, forgive us when we step on other people's property. It's a really interesting thing, right? Because Jesus as a Galilean probably didn't own any property. I mean, this is just helpful to think about. I don't know that that language would be original to him, as he was not a property holder.
Yes.
But we now do it. I mean, that's just my suspicion, right? If it's worth me throwing in, I did recently read this book about debt. It's called A 5,000-Year History. Debt, A 5,000-Year History. And there's this Margaret Atwood book where when this boy turns 21, his father presents him with a bill, itemized, for all the money he's spent. And it turns out that the son does in fact pay the debt, and that's the end of the relationship. And what the book talks about is this interesting history in debt, that when we pay our debts off, the relationship can be over. So it's not always clear that we want to pay all of our debts, because that would mean we're out of relationship with people.
Yes, interesting.
Maybe nobody cares about this. I don't know. Darlene, please.
I realize my perspective is a people perspective. I've not really thought about trespassing and debts in the Lord's Prayer as being financial. It's always, for me, it's always been, if we trespass against someone else, it's hurting them. It's crossing their boundaries. It's doing something that damages them in even the smallest little bit. And so I'm kind of amused at myself that my perspective is totally different than you guys in terms of helping me not hurt someone else.
I'm not convinced
to do with money.
I'm not convinced it's either or, but I do want to suggest it probably is a both and.
I was thinking the same thing, Darlene, about trespass as being in a relationship.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I kind of thought both words kind of meant morally bankrupt, if you will, but well, kind of like Darlene said, but maybe it's both.
We don't have a Jubilee year, so debts would be, we're stuck.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because Luke is the only gospel in which Jesus preaches a sermon in a synagogue, right? And the sermon that he preaches is not original. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because God has anointed me to proclaim good news to the captives and release, etc., right? To declare the year of the Lord's favor. That's definitely the Jubilee year, which is about money. So I don't know if it's interesting for folks to know. By the way, I'm not saying we need to change the language we use in the Lord's Prayer, but when you read Luke, it's hopefully easier to see where these liberation theologians are coming from and saying we need to forgive the third world debt, because first of all, they didn't even ask for that money. Dictators got it, and now we insist they pay it back, right? And so like go back to the gospel principle about a Jubilee. I guarantee you 95% of Christians, even if they used the word debt in the Lord's Prayer, would not be thinking about financial debts.
But if you think about it, it makes sense that it did address financial debts, but that was life and death to these people.
And I'm afraid it still is, right? And look, I don't know the answer to the problem, but like we're talking about what I think Luke is talking about semi-tangentially is that you can rack up $200,000 in student loans going to seminary, and how will you ever pay that back? Or you can get out a credit card, even though your credit is not good, and you can rack up 26% interest. You chose that. Of course, it's always like you picked that, but maybe that was the only way you could pay your light bill. So like, this is, I mean, Luke is really social justice-y. That's my read. And I don't know that we, I think we've probably tamed some of that, or said like there's a bigger picture here, and maybe that's in consideration with the other gospels. But it is interesting to consider about the difference between debts and trespasses, and if that is in fact different to us at all. I'm going to come to it because I talk about gratitude and generosity, maybe because I'm so like infantile in that, what is your debt when someone gives you a gift?
Mhm.
Well, the right answer is gifts are debt free. However, how gifts function socially for somebody like me is that gifts are a different kind of relational currency. Because I was trained to think when someone gives you a gift, right, there's a response that you owe that person, and that's a debt. That response is a debt. And if you don't respond appropriately, you've trespassed. All of this is social, but it's also currency. John, please.
Just kind of piggybacking on what you just said, I think that we live in a society today, and maybe it's just human nature today, and that's that any gift is really considered transactional.
I think a lot of our faith is that way. We talk about God gave us this gift, so what do you owe God? And the answer should be nothing.
I have Emery here. She said she just threw up and she wants to see Dad.
Mhm.
I think he's in a Zoom meeting.
He is in a Zoom meeting. Come on in.
You want to come in and hang out with her? Have you got Kleenex somewhere?
Yeah. Emily, come on here, baby.
Oh, that's good. I just wanted to let you know.
Thank you.
Okay, you heard that, so no surprise. I'm just going to go on mute for a second while you all continue to discuss.
Well, how was y'all's Thanksgiving? Or I'm sorry, I don't mean to change the subject, but
Mine was good.
Kind of
It was
fits.
quiet.
I have a question, and that's that when we talk about social justice, when we talk about social, if you look at how most of us function or survive in this day and age, it has to do with I'll call them, for instance, Social Security, Medicare, and that sort of thing. And then if you look at the Build Back Better bill, an awful lot of that has to do with perhaps thinking of a Venn diagram, you could say inside that Venn diagram is social justice. That is taking care of the poor, ensuring that that people who have not the resources can go to work and their children will be taken care of. So I guess my question, the thought that I had was, do you think that in its truest definition, Jesus was a socialist?
I think it's a foreign concept. I think like the way we read the scriptures, and forgive me, because I'm not going to say politics here. I'm going to say,
But Mike, wait a second. I just want to make sure I'm not saying that as looking for judgment.
Yeah, no. I think Jesus was a communist. I don't mean like the Soviet communist regime, which, by the way, they didn't call themselves communist anyway. They called themselves socialist. There's never been a communist self-proclaimed government. I'm not talking about a political system. I'm talking way of interacting, right, in which the community comes forward and people give what they're able to give, and people are able to receive what they need to receive.
And isn't that the basis of many or quite a few of the early Christian communities? They pooled their resources and helped each other, where they could. Those who had more gave more. Those who had none received. That's my understanding of the social structure of the early groups. Mike,
it's true that they say the first government in the United States was socialist because when the Pilgrims came here for religious reasons, they shared everything amongst themselves. So
Right.
that's just our beginning, and it's a Christian. I think it is a little Christian concept, if you will.
And it's
Sure.
interesting how it's gotten to be such a negative, terrible thing. John, when you said socialist, I just felt like, oh my gosh, he's going to be really negative about this concept. And so for me, it has a negative connotation now.
Yeah, well, I think there is a negative connotation associated with it. In particular, I'm sorry to be political, one particular party that has demonized the term, and I think often people who say it in such a way that it is very negative, I don't think they understand the concept.
Well, they're politicized words, so let's just be fair, right? And again, if I use the word communism, people usually are like, we don't want that, without thinking like, hey, communism is really about community first, people contributing what they're able to and people getting what they need, right? And I have no doubt that that's what the scriptures would like to have happen. Now, how we make that happen and how we do that fairly and how we uphold dignity, that's all up for interpretation, right? But it is clear to me that with the emphasis on Jubilee, for example, debt peonage is not okay. Institutional slavery, whether we do that in the African slave trade or we do that through the IMF, right, the International Monetary Fund, or whether we do that through, living in Appalachia, is not really like a biblical idea. So unfortunately, words have become politicized. So maybe we can say communalism, I think, is the goal. I'm not convinced Jesus was a real sophisticated politician. I'm just not convinced of that. But I do think what Luke invites, and I read a book about this that didn't sell very well. It's called Living on the Plain. I think that Luke really is interested in people being coplanar and not hierarchical. And that to me is a communal vision. And debts matter in that, right? Debts do matter. There are people who I would like them to pay me the debt so the relationship can be over because I'm not interested in going forward. I just have to be honest about that. Right. On the other hand, when I start to become obsessed about paying debts instead of giving and receiving gifts, well, I think there's opportunity here, whether we're talking about medicine or physical needs or actually just like things like presents.
Well, as you said, that once a debt is paid, relationship is over. And I had a relationship with an institution called a bank.
Yeah.
And when I paid my house off, that relationship ended. But at the same time, if I had a debt with a friend and whether I lent money to a friend and he paid it back, I would hope that would not be the end of our relationship. I would hope that the fact that I lent them the money to begin with enhanced the relationship.
Yeah, it's good to think about, right? Does God want us to pay debts or does God want us to receive? I particularly like when we think about our relationship with God. Is there a debt or was it a gift relationship? And then, when you think about the way like indigenous peoples handle gifts are meant to be shared with the community. Mm-hmm. I think that's probably accurate to the Hebrew understanding as well, that a windfall to one person is meant to be distributed and not hoarded. The reason I say that is Luke has the parable of the rich fool who gets this windfall and hoards it instead of gets this windfall and disperses it. That doesn't mean you can't keep anything. I just think there's a tension, right? And we often think, oh, you either give it all away or you keep all of it. And I'm not convinced that there's just two options, right? Sometimes we forget that because windfalls were absolutely windfalls, like we didn't earn them, they just showed up. Sometimes we could say, oh, I must have put myself in the posture through my own righteousness or merit to get that, therefore it's mine. And it's just sort of interesting, like I just think privatization of goods there's tension when you read the Gospels about that. There can be individuality in communalism. Those can coexist.
I have a question that I wrestled with this week a bit. And in fact, Chris and I, my wife, for those who don't know it, and I had a discussion along these lines, and it had to do with the, well, anyway, I'll get right to it. If you look at what is taking place in Israel right now, and I'm talking about where Palestinian lands are being taken by the Jewish state and converted to Jewish communities. There was a great deal of discussion this week, you may or may not have heard, about whether certain people were anti-Semitic or not. In particular, one of our congresswomen. And it got me to thinking, and this is a question, can you be anti-Israel as a state and yet not be anti-Semitic? And I think the answer is yes. What do you guys think?
I'm going to say yes as well, but I also want you to know that I think most Christian people that perceive themselves to not be anti-Semitic are fooling themselves. And it's really interesting when you read somebody like Amy Jo Levine, who's a Jewish professor of New Testament studies, to talk about how fundamentally anti-Semitic Christianity has become. We talk about the Old Testament. That's an anti-Semitic word. We talk about ritual purity and the law and the obsession of Jewish folks with the law instead of grace. That's anti-Semitism. It's reductionist as well. It's not even true, but it's come out of our legacy. John, I think you're talking about this other thing that I think becomes really important when we read a Gospel of Luke, right? Like, sometimes I think we have this tendency to separate spirituality from emotionality and physicality and from politics. I've heard people say, like, we shouldn't talk about politics in church. Well, I mean, I think Jesus is talking about a way of life. And if that doesn't inform our politics, I don't know. Like, it's not like I have a spiritual part of me that's disconnected from the emotional part of me, which is disconnected from my body. If I'm really honest, I'm like an organic system and there's a lot of conversations going on, right? So like, if I say something like, hey, forgiveness is a good idea, but we as a nation and as a policy, politically, we shouldn't forgive anybody, that just seems to be like a non-integrated way of being. I don't know why I was the first to talk. I'm sorry.
Herb, you look like you're going to say something.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think we'd all like to see the Israeli government, be more inclusive and less, Zionist, I guess. Yeah, I think what you said is right, John.
But the thing that I wrestle with so much when it comes to that is that what I think the Israeli government would say, or Jews in general, they would say, this was our land 2,000 years ago, and so therefore it's still our land, and we should be able to settle it as we please. And then I come back to thinking, okay, my house is on land that was once owned by a Native American, and if a Native American community or tribe came to me and said, hey, that was my land, get off, I'm going to say, no, wait a minute. So it's a big wrestling match, and golly, I sure don't know how to solve that problem.
Particularly because individual Native Americans didn't own plots of land. That's a totally foreign way of thinking. Mm-hmm. The fruits of the earth are for everybody to enjoy, and the earth belongs to no one.
We put them in plots of land.
Really small ones.
Yeah.
Yeah. What else is emerging from these readings for you all?
I have one more thing, if you don't mind me
Never.
usurping the conversation. I apologize. It was in the readings for not the biblical readings, but the disciple readings. And it was a question: what evidence do you see that people believe God is silent now? And my first thought was 3 dead in Oxford, Michigan, in a school. And the thing that concerned me about this is when that happened, I believe it was yesterday, it was by no means the lead story on the news.
Yeah.
There were so many other stories, and it was like the 3rd or 4th story. And I thought, when did this become so commonplace that it doesn't get much cover? It doesn't get the coverage that, let's say, it would have 5 or 10 years ago.
It's a great question. And maybe, I don't know the answer to that question, other than like that story is no longer exciting because it happens so often.
I just think what is going on in our country today, when you look at not only the political gap that seems to be growing between the left and the right, but I don't know. I'm just, I'm worried.
Yeah. I do want to share a quote that Tim Kavula gave me from this guy called Helder Kamara. God accepts the risk of appearing to be unjust. God looks unjust, but God is not. God asks more from those to whom God gives more. They are not greater or better. They have greater responsibility. They must give more service, live to serve. That seems like an interesting way of like individual responsibility and individuality and communalism. And I think, John, because we haven't like figured that out, I mean, just to be honest, I think most people have, and this isn't like judgmental, but I would say most people that I know, myself included from time to time, really sort of view God as their personal assistant. So there's a thing I don't like in God, you should fix it. And like the truth of the incarnation, I was reminded of by a colleague, is Jesus is not called God for us. Jesus is not called God solving us. He's actually just called God with us. So God's chosen to come alongside us, but not to straighten us out. That gets to be up to us. Do we want to talk about unclean spirits or demons at all? They showed up this week. We don't have to. We also can talk about wineskins, or, I mean, there's lots of different things we can talk about. We got a few parables. I just want to make sure you feel good with the coverage we're giving the material.
Yeah.
Ellen, Darlene, anything you want to add that stood out to you, or that you're puzzling over, or like, oh, this was new?
I'm fine with going on to those other topics, the inclusive topics. I had one thought before we do that. For me, it's interesting that the good news, the message that Jesus brought us, was rejected by the status quo, and so it had to be delivered to the outcasts, of whom we are. I mean, we're the Gentiles. We were the outcasts then. And now, as was mentioned in the video, those of us who are on the inside now in the churches we've made our own outcasts. We are outcasting those to whom Jesus really meant to take the message. It's the same type or it's the same people with the same situations that we are out labeling outcasts and rejecting. So it's, here we go again. It's the human nature of pointing to someone else who's different and saying we're better because we have the power, or we have, we are better, and so you are
Not as good.
not as good. Thank you, John. Yes.
But you know, that's one of the things that I read this week was that there is there aren't enough physicians in the state of Texas to cover the needs in the state of Texas. If you are living where we live, there are plenty of physicians. But if you go to places where there are either fewer people, like some of the counties in West Texas, there are no physicians. And if you go into some of the, like the 3rd ward or the 5th ward or whatever it is, they might have one physician that would be available to them. And it just seems to me that that is an issue we've got to address. And that comes back to what you said, taking care of those that have less. I mean, I don't have any trouble. I can call in a plethora of physicians, but people in the 3rd ward may not even be able to get in to see a physician.
Yeah.
One thought I had was that, just from what Darlene said, the people who didn't accept Jesus in that day and time were the chosen, the leaders and everything. And we've put ourselves in that position and made others the outcasts. So thank you for that, Darlene, because that really impressed me. And the other thing I got from the readings was the fact that Jesus didn't want to be known as a healer. He wanted to teach people how to live. And it seems in reading that he got frustrated sometimes in people trying to push him a direction he didn't want to go. And it did mention in one of the readings that he frequently withdrew to pray. And I think that speaks of the dilemma he had with trying to do what he felt he was called to do and what people wanted him to do. So that really struck me.
Thank you. Yeah, if it's okay to chime in, again, I read this book that hasn't sold very well called Living on the Plain. Probably all bad scholarship, but it does sort of say that one of like the goals of Luke is really to touch these sort of outcast people. And one of the ways the author argues this happens is through unclean spirits, right? And we often say like, oh, that's a demon, but demon is a Greek word. It's not an English word, and it means unclean spirit. And it just sort of means like there's something like not normal. To be really fair, I think if somebody had autism in the ancient world, you would say they have an unclean spirit. But I think we would also use that term if somebody had been abused and they had PTSD, because there's something nonlinear about PTSD. It's not like you can just like get over it. In fact, it's a kind of a funny thing that we even call it PTSD. It should be called TSD. PTSD means it's post-traumatic. I don't know very many people that are post that trauma. Most people I know are still in the trauma, right? You got people with shriveled hands, you've got people with birthmarks, you've got people who maybe like have neurodiversity. These people are showing up in the scriptures, and because they're not like normal, because they're blemished, it's perceived that they've got an unclean spirit. I mean, let's be fair, like that still happens today. We like to think we're more sophisticated. We've just changed categories a little bit, right? Like, I mean, I meet people sometimes and I think like, whoa, there's something strange here, which really just means we have a different worldview. And of course, I presume mine is right. and I need to presume that in order to like live at a certain point. But my fallback is rarely curiosity. It tends to be like judgment, right? And so you see these people over and over again in Luke who are kind of reconciled. And I think there's this great parable we read about a dinner party where a lot of the invited guests don't want to come. And probably they don't want to come because they don't want to be obligated to return the party. So who comes? A bunch of poor people who can't possibly pay it back. And because they can't pay it back, it gets to be a gift for them. And I'm not sure the rich people go to hell. I just think they miss a really good party. Now, I think a lot of us, myself included, would look at a party like this one and say, like, that can't possibly be any fun. Because, look, there's all these people who don't have etiquette and they're not dressed well. And I think the parable is very descriptive. I'm already missing that party. And parties are supposed to be fun. So I'm probably missing some fun by not being, I mean, I don't want to just say inclusive because that's another one of those political words, but really by not being inclusive. I'm not sure that Jesus actually like fixes something that's wrong with these people. I think what he tends to do is say like, hey, the unclean spirit might be in your perception that this person has an unclean spirit. So let's drive that out. Sorry, sick kid. Mom's here. That's good.
One of the things I've noticed when I interact with other people who are very, very different, and most people tend to shy away from them. When I interact with them, just kind of in a normal way, they tend to become more normal, whatever that is. When they feel accepted or comfortable or heard, they tend to calm down and tend to not be so weird. I'm not saying that I can take away that differentness, but they don't seem so offensive.
Darlene?
Yes.
Was that something that you experienced through your counseling?
Yes, more. I'm thinking more in terms of more street people or people who are psychotic, or I mean, I'm thinking really on the edge of our outcast labels. Yeah, that was a good question, John. And now that you've mentioned it, I think with what we would classify, and I'm using this word, normal people. None of us are normal. There's no such thing. But people, the average person that I would just do counseling with, people like us who come in worried that there's something terribly wrong with them. And when we sit together and they're just human, they're just going through a really hard time. And when they and I accept in a safe place that they're just like the rest of us that's having a hard time, then they chill, they calm down, they feel more in control, and they find within themselves the ability to manage what seemed unmanageable before. So I think we have within each of us the opportunity to help other people, whether on the far fringes or within our inner circle, be more okay just by being willing to be with them, sit with them, encourage them, support them. I think each of us has a healing power. And I think that's part of what Jesus's healing power was. I'm not denying that it didn't come from God, that it came from God, but I'm saying his acceptance of all of us was very, very healing.
because a few of us read this book, Nonviolent Communication, right? This is one of the things the author, who is a clinical psychologist, talks about, is when you put a label on somebody, in some ways you can diminish their personhood. So now you're talking to an ailment, not a human being that's presenting differently. And
Yeah.
Curiously enough, he gets that inspiration from a Jewish mystic called Martin Buber, who basically says, like, when I'm the healer and you're the wounded, we're no longer of any kind of possible equality. And so when therapeutic relationships aren't in fact like both ways, they're not therapeutic.
Yeah.
Now, I don't want to go to a therapist and then look for me to take care of their problems. And nor is Martin Buber saying that's how it's supposed to work, right? But when we address problems instead of total people, which, by the way, I think we're very set up to do socially, it seems like Luke is has a lot to say about that. There's another interesting thing, right? That this guy's paralyzed and he comes to Jesus, but we don't know that he wanted to come. His friends could have drug him there. I mean, he could have been saying, put me down, but he didn't have the ability to stop. So is this about his faith or the faith of his friends? Is this about faith or is it about desperation, and are they different? And then Jesus says that really interesting thing. He says, your sins are forgiven. And everybody says, who can do that? Only God can do that. And Jesus says, well, which one's harder? Get up and take your mat and walk away, or forgive your sins? I think the point of it is they're equally difficult. And salvation may be less about what happens to your eternal soul when you die than it is about your ability to live in the world. If the guy doesn't come and say, I want to go to heaven when I die, his friends say, we want our friend to be able to walk. I'm attracted to the wineskin language because I had a professor who really brought it up. The wineskin language to me is about this thing from Jean Piaget, which says that we all have an equilibrium, like a way we look at the world. In general, like the world is linear and it makes sense to us. Eventually something happens that questions that, like we get new data that doesn't fit with our worldview, and that introduces what he calls a crisis. So what will we do with the new data? We'll either like massage the data so that it fits our worldview, or we have to change our worldview to fit the data. Changing our worldview to fit the data is called accommodation. Changing the data to fit our worldview is assimilation. Either way, crisis averted or crisis resolved, right? You have a new worldview or you have the old one. I hear Jesus saying that you can't take new wine and pour it into old wineskins. You can't assimilate grace. You have to change your worldview around grace. So grace is not like a cool one-liner to get you through the week. It's an invitation to be transformed. But I think most of what we do, and I don't think it matters what religion you are, is we tend to assimilate data instead of accommodating it. And I'll just speak out of my evangelical experience. Most evangelicals care more about being right than they do about practicing righteousness. That's assimilation. And I know that that is part of our Western mentality is, hey, maybe might isn't right, but right is right. but I'm not quite sure that's the worldview God has in mind.
So in the Western, in our Western mindset, getting to right doesn't matter how you get there as long as you get there.
I just think that
What you define is right.
Yeah, I think we've made a mistake of thinking that faith is about being right instead of practicing righteousness. And they don't have to be different things. I just I just see the tribalism of denominationalism as being very right-centered and not unrighteousness-centered. And righteousness is not a piety category. It's a justice category. Righteousness is about how do you live out faith, you know? And one of the ways we tend to live out, I mean, I'll tell you, some of the people who know all the right answers in my life, they've just been the biggest jerks I've ever met because they know everything, but they're not nice. They're not good listeners. The reason they're not good listeners is because they've already figured out, so they have no curiosity. They listen to you so that they can point out where you're wrong instead of to hear where you're coming from. And like, I'm trying to unfetter myself from that because I'm a fixer and I went to college so that I could be right. And I didn't mean like, I'm okay, you're okay, we all do whatever we want. It's not like that's where we have to go. It's just that I see that we don't have a lot of grace and curiosity culturally. You don't wear a mask, you're stupid. There's something wrong with you. You're wearing a mask, you sheep. Who'd you vote for in the last election? Yeah, I don't like you anymore.
Yeah.
And I get it, it's because it's easy. And it takes us off of vulnerability of having to make space for somebody who could be really different from us. I'm just not sure that that's what the gospel is about. I don't see that as good news. I just see that as news. What's curious to me, and we read this in a book, in the book Mujerista Theology, she sort of says, only the people who are on the outside can imagine how to redo the world. Because all of us on the inside, like, it's working for us. It's just working for us at the expense of these other people. And what we normally do is say, since it's not working for you, it's your fault. There's something wrong with you or your work ethic. You've got an unclean spirit. Now, look, I will tell you, right, that if you think you're entitled to 2 months vacation just because work is stressful, I got trouble with that as an employer, you know, or like, hey, you're just not like feeling like getting this done, so you'll get it done when you want. Got trouble with that as an employer, but it's not like it's an either or, right? This is a grander conversation about, you know, what does work look like? What are the politics of work? I'm talking about millennials, by the way. John, you're scrunching your face. You know, and so millennials are real tough. They get a bad reputation, but they're like human beings. Like, let's be clear. They're not like this kind of category of like weirdos. A lot of what they think is foreign to us Gen Xers, right? I'm one of those, you know. Some of you guys are baby boomers, even more foreign to y'all, you know. Actually, I probably have a harder time with anybody because they're so close to me, like longitudinally, like they're the next group behind me. And I'm like, where are you guys getting this stuff? But to say like, oh, you took an extra vacation day because you're a millennial. I'm just not really sure that's like God's worldview. The way Soren Kierkegaard said it, which is curious because he's the one who came up with the either or concept. Once you label me, you negate me.
Michael, you use the term entitlement. That's why I was scrunching my head.
Got it.
Is anybody entitled to anything? I'm not. It's a question. That's all it is.
It's a great question. And of course, like all of us believe in entitlements, period. We all do, because we all believe in positional authority.
What?
Positional authority.
Explain that.
Well, like I have authority here because I'm the rector.
Oh, position. I got it.
I could be a scumbag, but I got a position.
Got it.
The president has a positional authority. Hopefully, we earn authority to go with our positional authority. We don't always, right? But if you believe in positional authority, which I feel fairly confident everybody on the screen does, we believe in entitlements, which are not always a bad thing. It's not good or it's not, we fall into this trap, good or bad. I think the question is like, what are the consequences of that thinking? And if we let it go completely, what would happen? And it's not always like you do this or you do this. There's just like, what are we buying into and how can we like massage what we do to look more like the worldview God's got in mind? Look, I'm going to tell you, I'm not interested in listening to theories about the rapture. I'm just not. I feel okay saying like, hey, I'm just not interested in that.
Right.
If I say, because you believe in that, I'm not interested in you, I've probably like made a mistake. I don't know if that makes sense. So there's room for boundaries, but I think when we boundary whole people off, maybe that's to our detriment and to theirs.
Coming back to entitlement, is it something that is owed? I mean, is that in the definition of entitlement? If you're entitled, are you owed something?
Probably.
And if that's the case, if you are owed something, that's a debt.
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm not saying all that's bad. I think that's just how society is set up. I mean, you know, like the whole reason we have attorneys is because we believe in enforcing contracts that other people made that don't involve us. I mean, that's like where the legal system comes from, is that it's in our social best interest to enforce private contracts. I mean, a lot of the law revolves around that principle. We've decided when you make a contract, and by the way, you know this, most contracts are not written. But like we want people to like keep up their deal of the contract. And if we can't rely on that, we're afraid that there'll be like anarchy. So I'm not saying that's the only function of the law, but it's a pretty major function of the law, which is why you can say possession is 9/10 of the law, right? I mean, because it's about contracts. Not all of it, it's not even good or bad, it's just descriptive. And I think what Jesus is trying to say is, hey, like we could do like some of these recent books and say like, oh, Jesus is the best CEO ever. But I'm not sure that's what he was interested in doing. I don't think he was interested in you streamlining the business. I think what he was trying to say is like, hey, God's got more in mind for the world than we're living into, and we can do something about that.
So when you talk about entitlement too, it makes me think about not just positional authority, but I guess like cultural, I should say national entitlement, you know, like I'm an American, so I'm entitled to this wage, or, you know, that. It's interesting to think about because I've always heard and thought about that, just how we think as Americans we're entitled to certain things. And so we put that label, you know, and it's like, but if we were looking at everybody else across the world, oh, why do we do that? You know, we do it. I guess we've just been doing it forever, but like looking at, you know, like third world countries, you know, and it's like, well, they're there, so they're not entitled to, like, why aren't we doing something about it?
Yeah,
this is the age old question, right? You know, it's like, but just the fact like that we say, it's not just about like you being a rector. It's like, well, I'm an American, so this is the standard of living I'm entitled to.
I think it's a great question, and I think it's really curious, right? Like, what is every human being entitled to?
Right.
Great question, right? And I see these posts, and forgive me, like I increasingly think they're odd, where people say like, I'm an American, this is a Christian country. If you don't like this, you can leave. Mm-hmm. But like, you weren't born here by your merit. Mm-hmm. You just were born here. Like somebody born in Haiti, do we think God's punishing them? Some people probably think that, which is like not a Christian idea. That's like a distorted Hindu idea called karma and dharma, which again would be a distortion of that. But we buy into some of that stuff, right? And this is where this is interesting thing that I think Jesus is not really excited about, which is called American Christian nationalism. God bless America. Well, I think that's fine as long as we say so that we can be a blessing to the world. But if we want God to bless the United States because we're good or because we deserve it, or so we can have like a better standard of living than anybody else in the world, I just don't think that has anything to do with the gospel. or the rest of the biblical arc, right? The way the biblical arc is, hey, Abraham, I'm going to bless you so that you can be a blessing to other people.
Yeah, it really definitely has made me think a lot when talking about like, excuse me, border control, you know, and immigration. And it's like some of the conversations are really harsh, you know, like about people who are coming here and they're not going the right routes, you know, and I'm like, they're struggling, like they're living in survival mode, you know, and it's hard because I think that dialogue has been going on forever. And like lots of people have been raised in it, like, oh, we've got to like shore up our borders. But really, like when you do talk to people, and it's like, oh yeah, I can imagine like if I was in a war ravaged country, like I would want to get out, you know, like I would want to get my family out of there. Or if we didn't have water or plumbing or whatever, I would want to get out of there. But it's just like the habit, almost American habit. And I think that's what happened too, like with I mean, obviously I'm a product of evangelicalism as well, but I noticed in the pandemic, it was either like you were talking about assimilation versus accommodation. It was either like some folks being like, this is not computing, like this doesn't work, or doubling down and being like, this is how this is going to fit we're going to fit this into our narrative, you know, and double down on it. But I think that I hope there's an awakening that let's question these narratives that we've, you know, had, and peel back the layers. So do the kind swing thing.
I hope you noticed the phrase this week. Jesus says, the Son of Man is the Lord of the Sabbath. Right? They say, why are you healing on the Sabbath? The Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath, right? And he gets frustrated. This shows up over and over again. He's like, if your donkey fell in a well, you'd pull it out. So why should a crippled guy have to wait another day? Right? And it's interesting, this phrase, Son of Man. I mean, why don't we just take that literally? Human beings are Lord of the Sabbath. Sons of humans are lords of the Sabbath, right? Which means like we're really invited to cultivate what Sabbath means. We could decide that it's a day where you do nothing, or we could decide it's a time, even if it's not on one day of the week, right? If it's interspersed, that Sabbath moments happen when God's economy shows up here.
I mean, when we do good, we're experiencing the Sabbath.
I think when we, to put it in Micah's words, right? When we do justly, when we love compassion, and when we walk with humility.
So over and over again, Jesus really drives home this issue of the rules of the Sabbath, you know, I mean, or, you know, he flaunts those rules quite a bit. Is he just trying to say, be less rule oriented and do more good, or be more righteous, or what?
I mean, I think it's a great question. I think that the real question is like, what is the Sabbath? And my understanding is the Sabbath is when God stretches out in time, right? So if you read Genesis, God makes light and dark, and then God makes earth and sky, and then God makes land. And then it repeats. So light and dark, now there's sun, moon, and stars. That's day 4, right? And water and sky, now there's birds and fish, living things to occupy the space. God makes land, now there's animals, right? So it folds, like it's totally symmetric. But instead of it just being a match, there's also this day 7, right? And with the ways the rabbis read it, is the first thing God makes is time. In the middle, on day 4, that's like the seam. God makes the things that govern time. And then on day 7, God enters time. So the rabbis say there's no evening and morning on the 7th day. So we're still in the 7th day. And the Sabbath is when we enjoy God's presence in time. So like when I was a little kid and we got a queen size bed, I was way too small, but I sure did try to fill it up. So I imagine like the Sabbath is God stretching to fill creation, if that sort of makes sense. In those moments we lean into that, our Sabbath moments. Now, because of Christian tradition, right, we don't have this demarcated Sabbath. And maybe that's to our detriment, to be honest. It is nice if we can put boundaries around to make sure that we're setting aside time. I think that's important because the Sabbath infringes on time. But even outside of it, I think what Jesus is saying is like, hey, it's not that you do nothing in time, it's that you stretch into God's presence in time. So, question, does a guy with the shriveled hand, does God want to stretch into that life or not? Well, you could do that 6 days of the week. And I think Jesus is saying, really, is that enough? Because there's 7 days in a week. And we made all that up. It's not like God invented the concept of hours and minutes and weeks. Like human beings made that up, right? But because that's our understanding, how do we stretch into that? And there's these interesting mystic people, right? Like John Muir, who says, hey, the cathedral God calls me to is the wilderness. So I'm going to go there instead of a building. And I think that's true for some people. I don't think it's true for all people. So I know that it's an either or, right? I mean, again, like, how do we make compartments and how do we boundary our time? Because we do, I think, need boundaries to make sure that we're stretching into God's presence in the cosmos. I think Luke confronts us over and over and over again with people we need to lean into that we normally pull back from, if that makes sense. It makes me think that a really good use of a church service would be two people who are having a disagreement get reconciled. Or somebody who nobody listens to gets up and interrupts the sermon and is allowed to say what they need to say and leave with dignity instead of being like called out by ushers. Now, sure, look, if there's guns, we got to talk about that, right? But you know, again, sometimes somebody interrupting is like a gun, but it's not at all like a gun. It's just not what we're used to. I'd be hard to do it every week because we're not used to it and it might not meet our needs. But sometimes I've learned in helping other people get their needs met is how we meet our own. And I'm pretty tied to hierarchical church structure because I participate in it. And I like having a space that's like our space. It's nice. So to me, like, it's not wrong to have it. The question is, how do we use it?
Y'all use it well. You have a school, don't you?
We do. We try to use the campus every day of the week.
My nephews go there. They really like it.
I like your nephews.
I was thinking too, I like that. I remember like as far as like order, you know, like having like a section of the oh my gosh, what is it? Well, if you think about like, do they do this in the, I don't know if this is just on TV, but it's just on TV, but in the matrimony, you know, it's like, speak now or forever hold your peace, you know? But having that like on Sundays, like speak now or forever hold your peace, like having like a bearing of the grievances or whatever it is section. But whenever I live, if I showed you all my house, I live in a lot of disorder. I'm just not a clean person. But it stuck with me a long time ago when somebody was like, but God is pretty, he's kind of like, you know, talking about like the creation account or whatever. And then just even thinking through like the intricacies of nature and how it all fits together, that it isn't disorder, it isn't chaos, you know, but it is orderly. And so I'll be inspired sometimes to clean my house because I'm like, okay, I think that order is a good thing, you know. But the surprises and the spontaneity is also fun as well. But I went to a church where it was like, let's just pray forever and ever and ever, you know, as the Spirit leads. And that worked for that season. But I do like the like order.
You know, Quakers do that once a month, and it tends to be the lowest. It tends to be the lowest attended service of the month because people like to have some sense of what's going to happen. Right? Surprises are great. And that's always a great reminder. You know, we plan for things in church and surprises happen, and we try to take them as surprises.
Mike, what did you say about once a month? I missed that.
Oh, Quakers get together and nobody talks unless they're led by the Spirit, you know, like that's the whole gathering. There's no sermon, there's no reading. Like you sit in a circle, and like if the inner light talks through you, then you do.
What are you guys familiar with the Shakers?
Yeah, of course, there's 2 of them left.
Yeah, but there's a wonderful Shaker village in Pittsfield, Massachusetts. And they've explained how their services were conducted. And of course, there were outsiders who sat in benches outside, and the Quakers did the Shakers did their dancing and what have you on the inside. And I was absolutely fascinated with that when I saw how their society functioned. Of course, the whole philosophy there was that it was going to die out because men and women were completely separated, period.
And celibate.
Yeah, exactly.
But that was so that women would be equal in the community, because anytime a woman is pregnant, there's inequality. That's how they perceived that hurdle. Which, by the way, there's only 2 Shakers because they can't have kids.
And you know, when the Shaker populations increased, interestingly enough, after wars, the men died, the women were left with kids, particularly after the Civil War, and they had a huge increase in the number of Shakers after Civil War and World War I, and even World War II to a degree.
I never heard of them.
They're interesting. They pioneered a lot of furniture and some hymns, and they were led by a woman. What do you know? So they're absolutely pacifist. You can go to Shaker Village in Berea, Kentucky. That was sort of where the movement spun out of as well. Like I said, there's not many left now, but they had a profound influence on American culture. The Shaker broom and the Shaker style of building furniture.
Yeah, I've heard of that.
Yeah,
Okay.
Shaker doors, that's a thing.
They're incredibly innovative, incredibly innovative.
And I don't think any of us would feel comfortable in a Shaker service the first time, because it would be so different. This, I think, recalls the interesting theme of the week, which is rejection. And what I see most often in evangelical Christianity is people reject us because we're Christian. And I'm going to suggest Jesus is inviting us to consider whether people are in fact rejecting titles or rejecting our unfaithful behavior. And that seems to be all of what's at play here, right? Many of the people who I know who are rejected because they're Christian, it's actually just because they're assholes. And that could be me any day of the week if I'm not thoughtful about it, right? And this is why we return together and think about, hey, if I'm feeling persecuted, why is that? And is persecution about death, or is it about growing pains? Because the truth is, growing up is painful. There are many times where I would just like to not have any more growing pains. And I'm even aware, like, this is probably going to be good for me, but I just don't want to do it right now in my spiritual journey. We think this is part of the question that we're being asked to consider. Rejection. What do we reject and why? What kind of rejection do we project on other people? How can we maintain individuality and communal life? Okay, I want to honor your time, which means I'm going to quit, but we will be back next week for lesson 21. Yes, sir.
Was this week 20 and 21 or just 20?
It was just 20. But if you already read 21, you're in good shape for next week.
Okay, good.
Sorry for changing the schedule around. I'm just trying to make sure we meet the sabbatical. And I do want to remind you, if you're interested in reading a very poor selling book about the Gospel of Luke, that is going to happen on Sunday, first 4 chapters plus the intro. So we kind of have this double opportunity to look at the Gospel of Luke right now, which fits. It's year C. And anyway, if that appeals to you, it's there. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
See you soon.
Bye.